The book you just published is about Roman Jakobson, one of the most influential 20th century language scholars. Yet he is not a household name. Would you like to give us a short introduction about him?
Yes, Roman Jakobson was one of the most influential linguists of the 20th century. In fact, some people say that his personal research program kind of set the mold for most of the work that's taken place in the 20th century. And his life was a kind of miracle. He was raised in a highly intellectual Russian-French bilingual family in Moscow of Jewish parentage. And as a teenager, he precociously got involved in the Futurist movement, which was an avant-garde art and literary movement in Moscow, right at the very beginning of the Russian Revolution. And so from an early age, he was accustomed to living in this very heady, highly stimulating environment. He got deep into that. He started studying folklore and got a degree. Jakobson's first degree was in folklore. He did some field work actually on urban dialects and urban folk myths that were still circulating around Moscow. And he began to use literary critical techniques which were developing among the Futurists, also known as the formalist movement. But around by 1920, the social landscape and political landscape had changed and become more dangerous for him personally, and so he decided to move to Prague. He went there actually as a representative of the Russian Red Cross, as a translator, but he mostly went there as a refugee. So he settled in Prague and immediately began to redevelop the kind of ambiance that he had constructed for himself in Moscow. In Moscow, he had helped found the Moscow Linguistic Circle, which was a informal group of young people who were interested in literature and politics, poetics, and art. And he took the idea of forming a circle of colleagues, a circle of friends who would get together on a weekly or monthly basis and debate intellectual issues together. And he transplanted that to Prague and helped stimulate the development of the Prague Linguistic Circle. Now, the Prague Linguistic Circle was really important in the history of linguistics because they were one of the first group of people who built on top of the results of Ferdinand de Saussure and helped develop a kind of impart resistance against some Saussurean ideas. They pushed back against some of Saussure's claims about language. And Jakobson was really instrumental in developing the Prague Circle. He lived in Prague for about 25 years. And during that period, he took a degree from Charles University in Prague and began teaching in Brno. He also made contact with another emigre to Prague, Nikolai Trubetskoy, who was about half a generation older than Jakobson, but is very interested in phonology, the study of the sound properties of language. And Jakobson and Trubetskoy formed a close working relationship. Trubetskoy unfortunately died before the beginning of World War II, and Jakobson took some of his ideas forward and developed them into one of his signature contributions to modern linguistics, which was the idea of distinctive features. And Jakobson's idea of distinctive features has really been foundational to modern linguistics, especially modern American linguistics. And his original insight was to break down the smallest particles of the sound properties of languages, the pieces of sound that make words distinctive. So the difference between like pill and bill, rest, some people conceptualize that as a difference between a p, like a P sound, and a B sound. Jakobson wanted to further atomize that and break that down even more, and so he analyzed the properties of a p versus a b as a collection of small features having to do with the acoustic properties of those sounds. So that a p sound and a b sound was broken down to a finer level, wherein they're actually very closely related sounds, but one of the 7 features that make up their acoustic representation differs, and that is the basis of the difference between those sounds. Jakobson claimed that the features of sound are all binary, So each one has a plus or minus value. And the difference between a p and a b is a single feature that has a plus value in one case and a minus value in another case. In this case, the feature of voicing would be minus for a p, and plus for a b. Jakobson's idea of distinctive features was really important with respect to his relationship to Saussure. Because Jakobson felt, although this is very highly disputed, Jakobson felt that if the individuals, the smallest components of the speech stream, can be further broken down into these tiny features that are all transmitted together, so that the difference between a p and a b, all 7 of those features are transmitted and comprehended together, that challenges Saussure's idea that the properties of speech are linear, that the units of speech are communicated in a linear way. Distinctive features have been taken later on in the 1970s and 80s here in America by generative grammarians. That idea has been spread to many other parts of language, so that semantics, a lot of work in semantics assumes that meaning relations can be broken down into individual features. And likewise, morphological relations, the relationships between parts of words, can be described in terms of feature differences as well. So one of the most important things that Jakobson is remembered for is his development of the idea of distinctive features. And in fact, when it came to collecting his works near the end of his life, he put distinctive features in the very first volume of a 10-volume set of his selected writing. So it seemed to have been very prominent to him as one of his major accomplishments. Going back to the history of his life, though, so he was in Prague until about 1939, when, because he was not only a Jew, but an outspoken opponent of fascism, it became impossible for him politically to remain in Prague after Czechoslovakia was invaded. And so he fled first to Denmark, then to Norway, then to Sweden. In 1941, he immigrated to the U.S. During the period in which the 2 years in which he was being, in effect, chased around Scandinavia by the Nazis, was really an important period in his life as well, because he thrived on turmoil and conflict. His life was in danger during most of that period. He had to live clandestinely and under very difficult circumstances. But it was during that period that he wrote and published one of his most distinctive works, which is a book called Child Language, Aphasia, and Phonological Universals. It's a very short book, but it brought together 2 things that had not earlier been viewed either as important sources of information about the nature of a language, nor had they really been viewed as related to each other, namely the features of child language, the properties of very young children, 2 or 3-year-old children learning a language, and the properties of the speech of people who have suffered traumatic brain injury, so that their language centers are somewhat disordered. And what he saw, he didn't do original research in either of those 2 fields, but he gathered together data from published research on child language, and he also gathered medical data from people in Sweden who had suffered brain injury. And he built a claim that the oppositions that emerge in child speech, the order of those oppositions that emerge in child speech. So, for example, he said the first opposition that emerges in child speech is the difference between vowels and consonants. So children exposed to the constant chatter of adults in their environment, the very first thing phonetically or phonologically that they extract from that is that there are 2 kinds of sound units, namely vowels and consonants. And then within the consonants, they begin to sort out certain kinds of consonants, and then each of those consonants bifurcates into another set, into another set, into another set. And Jakobson's claim was that universally children exposed to all languages first make that initial distinction between vowels and consonants, and then follow the same path of noticing and beginning to exploit systematic differences between pairs of sounds. So he made that first rather audacious and interesting claim about child language universally, and then he looked at data from people who had suffered brain damage resulting in destruction of their capacity to speak. And he made the additional claim that in the cases of deterioration of language, that process happens in reverse. So in other words, the difference between a vowel and a consonant would be the last thing that someone suffering from progressive deterioration of their language would lose. And so, for example, a speaker of English might lose the distinction between the th sound, like in the word this, and the th sound, like in the word thing. They might no longer be able to produce or comprehend that distinction, while at the same time they would still be able to hear the difference between p and b, because the p and b difference is more fundamental and earlier acquired and more fundamental. And he wrote this all up as he was being, as it were, chased around Scandinavia under very difficult conditions. He came to the U.S. in 1941. He arrived in New York City and took up a position at the École Libre des Hautes Études, which was a kind of university in exile where French and Belgian scholars gathered during World War II. So he worked there for a while and then was given a position at Columbia University. Eventually, he was appointed to a position at Harvard. And then in the last 25 years of his life, he had a joint appointment at MIT as well, as though one university just wasn't big enough for him, and he created a larger circle for himself by having appointments in two places. So one of his main accomplishments was in the field of phonology. But that's only one fraction of the work that he did and the interest that he had. He also made major contributions to historical Slavic studies and Slavic philology. He also studied grammar and made contributions looking at the principles of variance and invariance across languages grammatically and morphologically. And he also had quite a career in literary criticism and literary analysis as well, poetics. So Jakobson at his peak was a famously charismatic lecturer who drew huge crowds to his talks. He also was honored with membership in, I think, 7 or 8 different national academies of arts and sciences around the world. He guest lectured and was appointed all over the world. He was on editorial boards and given all kinds of honorary 25 or 26 different honorary degrees. So he was very successful in his day, even though there was also strong opposition to his points of view as well. In 1941, when Jakobson came to the U.S., he brought with him not only the broad philological training of someone who had been raised and gotten the education that he had, but he also brought with him Saussurean linguistics and the ideas about structuralism and his own counter-Saussurean ideas as well. And he transmitted those into American scholarship, both scholarship of language and then structuralism in general was spread to other disciplines as well. He was part of the group of scholars in Western Europe that had second thoughts about whether language had to be, that the essential items of interest in language were historical. So he was interested in looking at comparing languages in their synchronic states, sort of horizontally, and not just looking at languages as historical entities. And he brought that with him to the United States. The linguistics that existed in the U.S. at that time was very descriptive. And less interested in looking and comparing across languages. It was very influenced by the collection and analysis of Native American languages. And so there was a different sort of so-called taxonomic mindset prevailed here that was in some ways antithetical to Jakobson's synthetic, broad-minded, comparative, cross-linguistic comparative point of view. But one of the people that he most influenced was Joseph Greenberg, who was an American linguist who took up the notion, the Jakobsonian notion of looking for invariance within the variance of different languages and developed a very quintessentially American kind of way of probing into the universals of language. And he was a student of Jakobson's kind of indirectly at Columbia, and got interested in looking at what the implicational relationships across languages were. So how, if a language had property Y, what does the distribution of property of that property in other languages tell you about the possibility that property Y is linked to property Z? And so in that way, Jakobsonian linguistics kind of became diffused into American linguistics and spread fairly widely.
Jakobson was a very versatile scholar. He left a lasting legacy in many fields of philology, phonology, study of folklore, poetics, psycholinguistics, just to name a few. Modern scholars tend to focus on one narrow discipline. What was fundamentally different about Jakobson, and what allowed him to become a competent and brilliant scholar in so many fields?
That's a really interesting question. I think that probably his range was set by the kind of education he had, which was very broad and didn't see boundaries between disciplines. So for him, literary analysis and the influence of Picasso and Braque and Husserl were all people who had ideas that he applied to the study of language. And I think his sort of sense of like the home seat of his expertise was having to do with language. But he saw everything connected to language. To him, language was everything, and it had an influence on everything. And so movements in other fields and completely other disciplines, he was able to apply those directly to the study of language. And in that way, he really was from another century. Some people would say he's from a century beyond ours at this point. Some people would say he belonged to an earlier century, which is to say the boundaries between disciplines were very faint to him, and he applied the findings of one discipline to the material of another discipline really readily.
Where in linguistics is his influence the most important?
Jakobson had a huge personal presence and intellectual presence. He influenced people. He attracted other people. He also rubbed many people the wrong way. So there were many people who opposed his ideas and strongly pushed back against them. But I think in part because his favorite working conditions were a circle. The Moscow Linguistic Circle, the Prague Linguistic Circle. Later on, he created a New York linguistic circle as well. He wanted to work surrounded by other people in constant debate, controversial exchanges, highly charged emotional give and take. That was the way in which he liked to work, and that brought out the best in him. Not everybody liked that. Not everybody wanted to go along with that. So that, for example, his work in poetics in particular is really highly controversial. Because of his early exposure to poetry in the futurist poetry, he kept those interests alive throughout his life. And he began when he was especially by the time he was in New York, he heavily influenced Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was also involved in the University in Exile in New York City, and transmitted to Lévi-Strauss Jakobsonian idea of structuralism and both Saussurean analysis of language and Jakobson's counter-Saussurean ideas. He transmitted that a lot to Claude Lévi-Strauss. And together they wrote a number of papers about analysis of poems that became really highly controversial. The way Jakobson approached a poem was the way he approached language as well. So he liked to look at small poems, lyrics, very short ones. And he would instead of interpreting them, looking at the themes and the words together and to try to extract meaning from them, reproduce the poet's thoughts, he looked at the actual words. So he and Lévi-Strauss would do such things as count the number of participles in a particular stanza, look at where the stresses in the words lay, count the number of vowels, look at patterns of reproduction and inversion of the order of the distribution of nouns versus verb versus adjectives, look at where the lines broke. So they did a very close linguistic analysis of poetry and found intricate patterns of parallelism and opposition, antithesis and synthesis within poems. and developed a school of the analysis of language, or the analysis of poetry that emphasized looking at the small parts of language and dissolving the poem into the features of the words that were used to create it. Not everyone was satisfied by that way of looking at poems. Some people felt that for example, that some people countered that any kind of speech, even the language that I'm using right now, is littered with parallelism and antithesis and thesis, and that wasn't anything special about poetry. Jakobson rejected that and continued with his work in poetry along that vein, and influenced a whole field of poetics that looks at language in those terms. But it was highly controversial.
The 4-volume set is a collection of reflections on Jakobson's writings. Could you talk about your selection process?
Yeah, so this book is a 4-volume collection of critical assessments of Jakobson's work. So I immersed myself in months of reading literature evaluating Jakobson's work. And my job was to sort through it, and first of all, to figure out what were the sort of major, how to kind of lay some boundaries on the work of someone whose work really disregarded all boundaries and moved freely across disciplines, across topics, across ages, across techniques. And I decided to organize it, first of all, by shadowing to some extent the organization that he imposed on his work when he created his selected writings. So the first of the 4 volumes that I've created is, first of all, a series of, there's a long section on the scholarly apparatus for studying Jakobson. So I review the many bibliographies that have been created collecting his hundreds and hundreds of papers and books. And I review autobiographical and biographical materials, and I review the archival resources that are available for scholars who want to study Jakobson. And the rest of Volume 1 contains kind of overviews of his work written from as many different perspectives as I could find. So I prioritized, of course, sort of quality of insight into Jakobson's work, but also I wanted to hear as many voices as possible, because he himself listened to everything and spoke to everyone. So I've conscientiously represented his students, his colleagues, his critics, his opponents, everybody in between, and tried to represent people who are writing from across different national boundaries and different disciplines as well. So I tried to collect the writings of people who from Russia, from Eastern Europe, from Western Europe, from the U.S., and who identify themselves with different disciplines. So that's all volume number 1. And then volume number 2 takes up the topic that he treated in the first volume of his own selected works, namely his phonological contribution. So I look at the sound properties, his contributions to the sound properties, and people's assessment of that, including sort of a number of papers that look back on Jakobson from the 21st century and kind of sort through his legacy and which parts of it have been sustained, which parts have been built upon, and which parts have been transcended. So that's volume 2. Volume 3 looks as the topic of his, the next topic that he treated in his selected works was the grammar of words and the grammar of grammars. And so I look at his contributions to morphology and to the study of grammar. And then the 4th volume looks at his poetics, and also has several subsections on Jakobson's contributions to folklore, to anthropology, to cybernetics, to information theory. Those were all tools and disciplines that he began to apply to his work towards the end of his life. So my criteria for selection had to do with, first of all, try to get as much diversity as possible represented. So I wanted to hear many people's points of view, coming from as many different perspectives, coming to as many different and varied conclusions as possible about his work. It's hard to do because his oeuvre itself is so multifaceted and so rich, but I did my best to try to represent it as three-dimensionally as possible.
What is Jakobson's connection to Boston College?
I'm really I was really pleased to be invited to work on this project because when Jakobson came to New York in 1941, I mentioned that for a while he worked, or after a few years, he took up a position at Columbia University. And one of his first students at Columbia was Lawrence Gaylord Jones, who'd come from Pennsylvania and wanted to study Slavic literature and Slavic linguistics. And Jones became quite a close student of Jakobson's, so much so that I hear that at one point Jakobson was in a very bad automobile accident and broke both of his legs and was hospitalized for a number of months. But Jones would go to Jakobson's bedside in the hospital, and Jakobson would lecture to him individually from his bedside because nothing held Jakobson back. And then when Jakobson was appointed to the position at Harvard, Jones left Columbia and came with, I think, 12 or 14 other graduate students, left Columbia and came with Jakobson to Harvard and continued his education, eventually getting his doctorate from Harvard under Jakobson's mentorship. Soon after that, Lawrence Jones came to Boston College and founded the program in linguistics here at BC. So the department in which I work was actually, the seed of it was actually founded directly by one of Jakobson's early students. In fact, Jakobson and Jones collaborated in the publication of an analysis of one of Shakespeare's sonnets that is highly controversial and is one of his most cited works. So Jones then, under Jakobson's influence, kind of set the parameters for the study of Slavics and Slavic studies and linguistics here at Boston College. One of his earlier students was Michael J. Connolly, who was an undergraduate here at BC and then proceeded on to get a doctorate in linguistics at Harvard as well, and then came back and continued as a faculty member to build the department with Lawrence Jones. And Professor Jones sadly died about 10 years ago, but Michael Connolly is the sitting chair of our department. And as I got deeper and deeper into this project, I began to realize that a lot of the sort of folk practices and curriculum of our department are directly taken out of the influence of Jakobson. So right outside my office, there's a big panel of books on Czech poetics, which I doubt if those were Jakobson's actual own books, but certainly they were collected under the influence of his lifelong interest in the Czech language and in Czech poetics. The curriculum in our program in linguistics is an unusual one nationally because, for example, our students take 2 courses in what's called philology, this close study of older languages and how they've evolved, which is a deep interest of Jakobson's, and I feel a certain echo of Jakobson's influence that is, our current day undergraduates are still hearing whispers of that echo.